So this is AWC in Conversation. My name's Joey Clark and I'm speaking to you from Sydney, and the area where I live and work is Gadigal country, and I acknowledge the elders and traditional owners of the area. My guest today will be a familiar face and a familiar voice to many of you. Wendy Harmer is a journalist, comedian, author, producer, and is well known as the co-host of ABC Sydney's breakfast program with Robbie Buck. And importantly, she's also a supporter of AWC. Wendy, thanks for joining us.
You are very, very welcome. Look at that snazzy background that you've got there. So, I know it's a complete distraction, but why don't we just take a minute when everyone just looks at my bookcase, how shoddy and messy it is.
And this is after, the last 5 minutes, Wendy's been frantically trying to tidy it up. So,
wow, what does that say about what it did look like? I wish I had a background like you. But
yeah.
Lovely to be here, Joey, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Now, Wendy, you've just returned from a road trip through outback New South Wales, and we might come to that in a bit. But most weeks I'm talking to people from Cape York or the Kimberley. Most of our staff are in remote locations. What's the exotic location of your home office there?
Well, I am in Collaroy on the northern beaches of New South Wales, about halfway between Manly and Palm Beach. I was thinking about setting up this little webinar with a view out to the ocean I'm way up on the side of a hill, looking down over the ocean, which is about 10 blocks away. But technology defeated me and I thought you'd all hate me anyway. So here you are in my office.
Especially on such a glorious day. Now, Wendy, you're a supporter of AWC. Have you always had a passion for the natural world and for conservation?
Well, you know what, Joey, I think everyone does. Everyone does from childhood. We all have a passion for the natural world and all the things that live in it. So I think it's probably not worth asking, do I have a passion for the natural world? Because have you ever met anyone who doesn't?
That's a good point. Do you think, growing up in the country contributed to that? Was that, was that a formative time for you growing up in the bush?
Yeah, very much so. My father was a rural school teacher and he taught all across rural Victoria, and all the places that I grew up in, Joey, where they were little tiny rural schools at a place just out of somewhere.
Okay.
And so I lived in Warncourt in the Central District, which means place of many bandicoots. And that was a tiny school with 26 kids in it. And that was just out of Colac. And then we lived in California Gully, which was just out of Eagle Hawk, which was just out of Bendigo. And then we lived in Selby, which was just out of Belgrave, and then just out of Upwey, and then just out of Melbourne. And then we moved to Freshwater Creek, which was just out of Geelong. Yeah. And it's been a bit like that, So here I am in Collaroy, which is just out of nowhere, really. It's just exactly where it's meant to be. Oh. And my husband, Brendan, is a former chair of the Surfrider Foundation of Australia. And so he has a real passion for the beach. It's a funny thing, though. It's a funny thing. I think that there are two groups of us in Australia, two tribes almost. They're the saltwater and the sweetwater tribe. I'm here on the side of a hill. My office could be looking out at the ocean, but I am lucky enough to have a bit of a view of an escarpment, and that is actually my favourite landscape. So I'm very, very at home in the inland, and he's more of a coastal human.
I gotta love that Sydney sandstone. I'm from the Blue Mountains, so I very much relate to that. And I see in my research that you voted in last year's 2019 Bird of the Year poll for the brush turkey. Do you have a particular affinity or... Or are you waging war on the brush turkey?
It was ironic, Joey. It was ironic, but I've got to pay. I've got to give the props to the old brush turkey. At one point here in our yard in Collaroy, and we do back onto a bit of bush, we had 9. We had 9 of them. And so well, they are absolutely remarkable birds, and
Yeah.
the fact that they've been able to make a home here. But we're really lucky where we are, because we're back onto this little parcel of bush. We have blue tongues here, we have bats, we have kookaburra. It's bird wars every other day. We have a bandicoot. How lucky are we?
Ah.
Because I do breakfast radio, I'm often walking through the yard at 4:30 a.m. There's the bandicoot. Possums don't even start. Yeah. So the interesting thing about it is, Joey, is that on our trip, and this is something that I found really, really disquieting. I think there was more activity in my backyard than there was in many of the places, more animal activity, bird activity, than in many of the places that we camped along the way from Sydney to your place at Scotia and back again. And that, it was as quiet as a tomb after the bushfires and the drought, and of course feral animals. And that was gave both my husband and I, a real sense of sadness. I have to say sadness. I can't put it any other way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's interesting to think about cities acting as a refuge, especially after the bushfires. We are very lucky in Sydney with large patches of bush still quite close, and in some ways protected by urban sprawl, because we tend to defend the city against big bushfires and things. So there were all sorts of interesting species turning up after the bushfires.
Well, we had a couple of black cockatoos here, which we had never seen before. Yeah, so that was as I say, interesting. I was actually talking about it on radio, and then my colleague on ABC Sydney, Richard Glover, wrote a piece for the Washington Post expressing that same sense of desolation when you go out into the bush at the moment, with that extraordinary loss of wildlife we had during the bushfires.
Yeah, that's right. And at AWC, quite often, we look at the maps of where mammals used to occur historically, and the contraction in those ranges. A lot of things have gone extinct from the mainland, and some people refer to it as a marsupial ghost town. There are all these things which which would have been in abundance originally, which are no longer there. But Scotia is different to that. So let's talk about your road trip. And Wendy, do you take a lot of road trips? Is this your normal kind of holiday?
Well, I have to admit to this. We do have a recreational vehicle. Yes, we do have the Winnebago. Some years ago, my dad was living solo. He retired from teaching, and he was living in Lara outside Geelong, and he was a bit down the dumps, and I had the wherewithal and the money, and so I bought him a Winnebago, an RV. Anyway, I didn't see him for 3 years after that, so he was happy. And then he developed Parkinson's, and so he gave the vehicle to us. So yes, you could say that, yeah, we put in the hard yards, we put in the miles, over the years. Yeah, and we love it, and we get out and about whenever we can. And in fact, I was, my husband and I, Brendan and I, were hoping to visit Scotia last year, but we were just about to take off in about 3 days, and then we got the word through that the pipes had frozen and exploded, and we couldn't come, and it was a disappointment. So we finally got there this year. Would you like to tell? It was 3.5 Ks the round trip.
Yep.
And
3,500 kilometres.
Yeah.
I've got a map, so maybe.
Okay.
Here we are.
All right, can you trace it? So
yep.
Mount Wilson, Kapiti, Goolgong,
Yep.
Mudgee, Dunedoo, Dubbo, Narromine, Ningen, Coburg,
here. Yep.
Broken Hill, Menindee, Talano, Broken Hill, Scotia, Wentworth, Balranald, Wyalong, Canendra, Orange and Bathurst.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty big loop.
It was. Of course, we were there when we went down to Mildura, and we were right on the border there at Wentworth, and the defence force and the police were there. So not that we were looking to get into Victoria, but we couldn't have, even if we'd wanted to.
And this was the time where there was that brief reprieve, and it felt like things were opening up, and we could actually travel around a bit. Seems like you got in just in time with that.
Yeah, but I've got to say that all the regional centres that we went through were absolutely exemplary in the way they were following those rules of isolation. They, you know, the regional centres were right on top of it, and so yeah, we were. It was really great to see that. And
So,
we only ran out of petrol once.
okay.
But
In
I'll
a
tell
very,
you how that happened in a minute.
all right. Was that in a very remote area or?
I think it's your fault,
All
actually.
right.
I'm laying this directly at the feet of Scotia. So,
Our
okay,
apologies.
so we get out of Broken Hill and we go sort of, was it southwest to Scotia?
Yep,
Not
basically.
very well signed, I've got to say. You really are hiding your light under a bushel. You're keeping it all very secret. Anyway, we weren't exactly sure on how many Ks and this and, you know, whatever. Anyway, coming out of Scotia, we ran out of petrol 6 Ks out of Wentworth. But of course, being in an RV, made a cup of tea, had a nap, NRMA, good to go. But it is actually your fault because I don't, oh, we didn't do the maths or something like that.
Right. Okay. Oh, well, we'll leave that one. And can you describe the landscape? So you said it was, you know, very much drought affected. And as we know, Western New South Wales has been through years of drought now, many years of below average rainfall. So you approached Scotia from the north, it sounds like, from Broken Hill.
We were at Menindee and we camped on the banks of the Darling Barker.
Yep.
And of course, that river is way, way down. Be interesting to see whether any of the recent rains we've been getting in New South Wales are making their way there. But we were told that the Menindee Lakes would be full, and from the vantage point that we had, there were cows grazing on it. So I mean, it was distressing to see.
And then driving into Scotia, as you said, it's, it feels very remote. It's a long way. Well, we always say it's a long way to the shop if you want a sausage roll. But do you notice a change in that landscape? Because there's been obviously a lot of feral animal control, removing goats and feral herbivores. Was there a very obvious shift in the landscape as you approached Scotia?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I note that, and we stayed with one of the local landowners there, Rob McBride, who's on Talano. And he, like many landowners, they really value the feral goats because that's how they say that they can make money. But of course, in Scotia, we were told just what an impact those feral goats do have on native populations. So yes, I guess we started to see it a little less denuded on ground level, a bit more, canopy of trees and so on. Yes, we did notice a difference. And of course, by the time we got into the fence, inside the fence, we did notice a very big difference.
Yeah, and that's the kind of signature project at Scotia, is this large feral predator-free fenced area. Our listeners will be familiar with that type of project.
Yeah.
But I just want to share a map of where Scotia sits in the landscape, because the sanctuary itself sits in the middle of a kind of conservation corridor. So because it's adjacent to a number of other areas which are managed for conservation, it forms a contiguous area of nearly 1 million hectares under some form of conservation management. So that's across the border. There's a couple of properties in New South Wales, but then joining on with Dungarly Conservation Park in South Australia, and down into Gluepot Reserve, which is a BirdLife Australia property. So that's it's quite often the way that AWC likes to situate ourselves so that we can have an impact beyond just one property and have a regional impact on conservation.
And of course, when we were visiting, of course, we weren't able to go over the South Australian border. That border was closed, just to mention that.
Yeah, and this area, I should mention, is the traditional country of the Barkangji people, and they're especially linked to the Darling River. And then west of the Darling, around Scotia and into South Australia, the Dungarly people are the traditional owners. So pay our respects to them. Okay, so Wendy, when you got to Scotia, who did you meet? What was the team out there?
Well, we met a fabulous team. We just had such fun. We met Trevor and Tali and Rhiannon and Jojo and Hamish and Dan. Look, we took our own vehicle in there, but we should mention to people, of course, that there are you know, great digs there. There are, you know, rooms with en suites and lovely little cabins all over the place. There were a couple of volunteers there as well who had joined the camp, and they were doing extraordinary things around the property. They were mending fences, well, not fences so much, because we'll get to the fences, I'm sure, in a moment, but mending stairs and doing some maintenance work. And they had just arrived as volunteers and were lending a hand in the place. And I mean, they were having, you know, there was two couples there who were having a fantastic holiday as well. So we should say that we were just beyond that roof there, camping in our RV, but there were rooms were available. And then up the track that you can see there, and just a little beyond, is you know, the main administrative block and the kitchen and the lounge room and so forth. And you could have a meal there. We could watch films there. You know, get together, sit on the couch, have a chat, have a few drinks, etc. And so, yeah, that was how it was set up, pretty much like any, you know, any kind of resort that you would go to in a way. No spa baths, though. I didn't notice any of them.
No, resort might be a bit generous, but yeah, it's comfortable.
Yeah.
And, you know, the team is based out there full time. And that's another key part of AWC's model, is that at all of our projects, or virtually all of our sites, we've got staff on the ground permanently. And we think you need that. That's a really important part of our model.
Well, one of the extraordinary things that, you know, I didn't realise, I mean, of course, we should say that the whole property is surrounded by a 2-metre high fence to keep the ferals out and the little marsupials in. And we're talking about bilbies and numbats and bridal nail-tailed wallabies. I hope I've got this all right.
Yeah, you do.
And I thought, okay, you put the fence up and they're in there, and that's fine. And then you walk away and you set and forget. Absolutely untrue. That patrolling that perimeter happens daily, because ferals are working out ways to, you know, dig under or damage the fence or whatever. And so the amount of maintenance required to keep that fence going, I thought, was really extraordinary. But it did also make me feel, though, Joey, that what hope have animals got on the outside of this fence, which is so meticulously maintained? I mean, the work that you're doing there in saving all these animals and these species is extraordinary, but their long-term future, you know, you've got to be very disheartened in many ways.
Yeah, I think, you know, well, there's a multi-pronged approach. So we know that for some species, fences like this are the only chance. You know, you have to get to zero predators for things like bilbies to survive. They just, you know, won't survive in an open landscape with feral predators. You know, things like the Burrowing Bettong went extinct on the mainland and only survived on offshore islands where there are no feral predators. Yeah. So, you know, fences are critical if we want these species to persist. But in the longer term, we're also looking at, you know, what we can do outside the fence. So we've got a long-term research project looking at how to control feral predators without a fence. And you would have seen some of that work happening at Scotia, or that has happened at Scotia. And then in the longer term, again, and at a bigger scale, we're also investing in research into gene drives, which is a potential genetic solution where you might be able to remove whole populations of feral animals, although that's in its very early stages. So I think it's important to maintain the vision, and, you know, that vision is a landscape full of animals as it would have been a couple of hundred years ago.
You think about what it must have been like, you know, you know, Indigenous kids growing up with these little creatures everywhere. You know, it's just such a different way of, a different thought about the landscape, I guess. The other thing that we found was really extraordinary, just was the amount of research that is going on there too. I mean, you've got this fully kitted out, what would you call it, a lab, a surgery or whatever, where you're bringing animals in and you're weighing them and you're tagging them and taking all these meticulous details in huge databases. This also keeps all the staff very much employed full time. Not only that, going and looking at traps, and I mean, you're busy. It's not like you're just sitting there. The staff are just sitting there and there's little animals running around. There's nothing to do. They're flat out.
It's very much hands-on conservation, and that's the approach. If you visit any of our sanctuaries, you'll see that we're out there managing actively, intervening to deal with the threats, monitoring to make sure that the wildlife's responding positively to that, changing our methods if we see that there's an issue with management. So Wendy, what animals did you see while you were out there? Because as you said, inside the fence, there's a bunch of different mammal species that have been reintroduced. What about birds? Did you see any of the mallee birds while you were out there?
Oh, well, look, we didn't see a lot of birds, but highlights. I got to hold a bilby. I didn't manage to catch it with my bare hands. Trevor gave it to me to hold. Oh man, I mean, it's such a silky, beautiful thing. You know, its fur's not spiky. It's just a lovely, it make a gorgeous hat. No, they're just really, oh, what a fabulous creature it is, the bilby. I mean, that is going to remain a highlight throughout my life. That not only did I see a bilby, but I got to hold one. They are so, so lovely. Also, this was just stepping out, just outside, the cabins there. Your bridal nail-tail wallabies.
Yeah.
Saw a couple of them actually having a very, very vigorous session of mating.
Oh, really?
I got up so close. I thought, oh my gosh, I think I might be. I might be intervening here. I think I should let them go at it. But just right outside the window, very quietly. But they were absolutely gorgeous. Tried to find a numbat, absolutely in vain. Went numbat hunting with Talia and Rhiannon, day and night.
Oh dear.
Sunset, dawn. Didn't see a numbat, but we did get to go and feed the marla that are being looked after there. Now, the elusive numbat, I really want to be a numbat. It was really funny. My husband, the gal said, oh, it looks a bit like a loaf of bread with a toilet brush. So my husband, Brendan, he got a loaf of bread and a toilet brush, and he positioned it in a bush and took a picture of it. And they said, oh, that's actually not a numbat. Sorry, Brendan.
They are tricky, but they're one of the animals that's active during the day. So they come out to hunt termites when they come up to the surface as the earth warms up. Yeah. So that's one of the species where you don't have to go spotlighting. If you're lucky, you'll spot one during the day, but they are tricky. They're very tricky.
They're very, very tricky. Well, look, I mean, why not? And then, of course, you're going to tell the story of the wonderful marla.
Yeah, that's right.
We got to have a very up close and personal with.
So AWC supporters will be familiar with this species. It's a fantastic little orange kangaroo, which is specially adapted to desert landscapes. They were once found right through the inland deserts, through Northern Territory, South Australia, Western Australia.
Look at its little hands.
Some people think it's like a T-Rex with those short arms that look a bit useless.
Oh, look, who is not on Team Marsupial, Joey, really? Well, actually, my husband's on Team Reptile. We didn't see many of those, but, oh, look, Team Marsupial. And, the species loss here. You know what is quite extraordinary, of course, too, Joey, is so few people that you meet can name more than a few species of marsupial beyond your kangaroo and your wallaby. And I mean, we've just, we're in marsupial heaven here in Australia.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think the more that people do get familiar with these animals, the more they'll care about them and hopefully support their conservation. I should just remind people too, you can ask questions in the Q&A if you've got any. But I might just talk a little bit more about the marla. So this was found right through the deserts, as I was saying, and went extinct within my lifetime on mainland Australia. So it was 1991, the last population blinked out in the central deserts. And that population was being intensely monitored by scientists after they'd found it. And it was a combination of damaging fire regimes, so big uncontrolled wildfires, and feral predators, so especially foxes and cats, which did them in the end. Yeah. But because that last population was known and was being studied, some animals were taken in as a kind of insurance, and they were distributed among a couple of different kind of insurance populations, one of which are these marla at Scotia, in a special smaller fenced area there. So even though Scotia is outside their natural range, it's a little bit too far south and not quite the right habitat for them. They were sustained at Scotia and nurtured and looked after as an insurance population to basically ensure the survival of the species. And now, because we've got this project in Central Australia at Newhaven, we're able to restore that species. And that's happened over the last 3 years.
Well, that's quite right, because the marla that we saw, we were lucky to get to see them because they were about to be shipped out.
That's right. So the last of those Scotia marla are about to make the move to Central Australia, to Newhaven. So I think
and the point is, because for the Indigenous people there, they form a very large part of lore and stories and so forth. So yeah, that's another thing to think about. I mean, these little animals that have gone missing have also hollowed out an entire a culture in a way too. So
yeah,
very interesting thought. Yeah,
absolutely. There's one other species at Scotia, which I'm not sure if you came across, a burrowing bettong.
oh please,
One of those ones.
that. We weren't about to see a burrowing bettong. Are you real?
Look, yeah, the drought has definitely affected their numbers, but you're talking about, it's not just the animals, but their significance beyond species conservation. And these little animals, we call them ecosystem engineers because they can turn over tons of soil. I think 20 tons of soil in a year turned over by one bettong. And that's really important because it improves water infiltration, the nutrient turnover in the soil. Studies have shown that germination rates for a bunch of native plants are improved by having small mammals in the landscape.
Yep.
So these are obviously boom and bust species. Populations go up and down, and it seems like you were there in a bust. But it's really important that these animals are able to repopulate because they play a role in the broader ecosystem in enhancing its ecological health. So,
Well, when you say we were there in a bust, of course, we were there in winter and there were the effects of the drought. Of course, we had a lovely report the other day that about 27 millimetres of rain, I think Tali told us, so that was good. Now, Joey, I've got to tell you a story about the cats.
oh yeah, go for it.
All right. Well, when we stayed with Rob McBride on the Big Talano sheep station there on the banks of the Darling Barker, he told us a story that years and years ago, I don't know how many generations this goes back, but they had a rabbit plague. So what they did was on Talano station, they got 200 cats sent to the station and they let them go in the bush to chase the rabbits.
That's a huge act of environmental sabotage, I must say. Can you imagine doing that these days?
Oh my goodness. Well, I suppose that we actually do, really, don't we? In many ways, we do let 200 cats go into the bush every night. But yeah, I just I was telling that story to the people at Scotia, of course, and they were like, oh, so yeah, many mistakes have been made, of course.
Yeah, that's right. And it's there's a Paul Kelly song, and he says, "To be good takes a long time. To be bad takes no time at all." Yeah. And a lot of this work, it's long term to restore these landscapes.
Joey, I should ask you, and I know we talked about this when you came onto the radio with me at Sydney, and you were talking about the possibility of some genetic control of feral cats. Can you tell us again what that entails?
Yeah, and this is something that I need to say it's very prospective. So we've invested in research with CSIRO.
Yep.
The specific technology is called a gene drive, and it's a way of manipulating the gene in an organism. So you can basically copy and paste and edit genes like in a word processing document. So one idea is that you could modify a gene which determines the sex of the offspring. So say you got a population of cats and you could modify it so that they only give birth to male offspring. And those offspring also carry that gene. So rather than, so basically that's inherited by all of the offspring of those original cats. And that gene gradually spread throughout the wild population until there are more males than females. And because of that sex ratio, the population collapses.
Obviously, this is going to be very gradual. I mean, do you think that our native species have that long?
So I think that's why we need these multiple different approaches going at the same time. So fenced havens are critical because they ensure that species will persist in decent numbers, so that we're able to repopulate when we can deal with those larger scale threats.
Yep.
So I think it's really urgent that we come up with a broader scale solution to feral cats. I mean, other groups are looking at whether you can get our native species used to some level of predation, so whether you can kind of train them, and there's been different results from that. But we definitely need to be looking into a landscape solution to allow these animals to repopulate.
Yeah.
With the gene drive, we always get lots of questions because I think everyone kind of clutches it as a, you know, a hopeful avenue. I think in the first instance, it's really important to say that would be firstly applied to a smaller animal like feral rats, and probably you'd start off on an oceanic island where it's very carefully quarantined. You want to make sure you're getting that stuff right, because there are also risks. You know, there are cat species very close to us in parts of Southeast Asia which are critically endangered. So you don't want to, you know, invent something that's going to...
Well, exactly. You know, there's been plenty of examples of that. I
Mm.
guess I should tell people that it wasn't like we were going back to school. When we were out there, we had a fantastic time. There was one evening where we set up on a dune, on one of those, you know, red dirt dunes. I mean, that red soil, I mean, it is my favourite place to be. It feels like the I don't know, it just feels clean and, I don't know, refreshing. I love being in the red soil. Yes, that's the red soil and the spinifex clumps. That's spinifex, am I right?
Yeah, spinifex and mallee eucalypts. Yeah, it's beautiful country out there.
Beautiful country. And of course, we were at sunset. We were sitting up on a ridge there, and we had canapes and we had champagne and we had our beers and watched the sun go down. So there was, you know, plenty of fun to be had, as well as it being very, very serious. I guess we should tell people how they can go. I mean, it's not like you can drive up. It's not like a caravan park.
No, that's right. So Scotia isn't open for the public to visit. We do occasionally take groups of supporters there. So Wendy came as a guest of AWC. So it's been set up quite well by Earth Sanctuaries, the previous owners, but we're now focused entirely on conservation. So we take a limited number of supporters. At other sites, there are much better opportunities for visiting. So Newhaven, which we just mentioned in Central Australia, has a really great campground set up, run by volunteers, I should say. Mount Gibson also has a campground, and that's in Western Australia. So if there are WA people listening, I think you've got a little bit more freedom of movement than us in the eastern states. So there's also Karakamaya in the Perth Hills, where you can go on a guided walk at night time, and that also has a feral-free fence, so you can always drop into Karakamaya and see bettongs and things over there. And then one of our most famous sanctuaries is Mornington in the Kimberley, which is very well established with a restaurant and safari tents and a campground. So when borders do open up a bit and we can travel around a bit more, there are plenty of AWC sanctuaries that are well set up for visitors. And, you know, we really love sharing this work. All of our staff are absolutely dedicated to what they do. They're driven by passion for conservation and for looking after the wildlife. And, you know, we'd like to give everyone a taste of that. At the moment, you'll have to just stick with me in the webinars, I think, because a lot of that travel has been curtailed by COVID, unfortunately.
But, you know, these are not just serious insects. There's a lot of fun to be had there, and we loved everyone we met. We had a really great time. So it's, you know, I mean, just watching, as I say, the dedication of folk, and, you know, learning stuff. Like, I remember we went out with Jojo every morning, and we would be able to look at the tracks, and soon enough we'd be able to identify a bird or a bettong or a numbat or something like that. So, you know, really lovely stuff. We had such a good time. Thank you so much for inviting us.
You're very welcome. Wendy, I might just see if there's a couple of questions here before we wrap up. So we've had, someone was asking about how many marla are still at Scotia. So I think there are 19 individuals left at Scotia, and all of those will be transferred to New Haven very soon. And if you're not already...
The one that I stole and is now in my backyard. They're so cute.
we make sure to check everyone's vehicles and pockets very carefully as they leave. So yeah, if you're not signed up to the email updates, you can go to australianwildlife.org and just subscribe there, and we'll let you know when those marla are travelling north.
Have you got any comments about my bookcase one way or the other? Because this is the first time I've done a webinar. I'll let everyone see my bookcase.
Oh, you're a natural, Wendy.
Move on.
Nothing about the bookcase here.
Okay.
Someone says, Wendy, you can be the ambassador for conservation in Australia.
Well, I'm sure everyone is. I think everyone is an ambassador for, wildlife in Australia. We've got a bit of look, I've just got to say, just on a personal level, we don't have a cat at our place or a dog. And my daughter has wanted a cat her whole life. This has not been an easy sell at my place. No, You can't have a cat. But, the day that we saw a very ancient cat walk in the back door with a baby blue tongue in its mouth, well, that was it. That was it for us. There's no more.
Especially knowing that you've got bandicoots around in the garden.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, so now she's had to make friends with the chickens. It's very sad to see to see her bring the chickens in the house and treat them on, sit them on her lap as if it were a cat. But that you've got to. I think you've got to walk the walk, if you're going to talk.
Absolutely. We always get questions about volunteering too, so I might just preempt those. Sure. If you're interested, you can register at our volunteer portal. So go onto the website, you'll find it in the menu, and you can sign up so that whenever we've got volunteer opportunities, we'll send out an email. Obviously this year that's been affected, but there are still some opportunities at our New South Wales sites for people in Western Australia and other states which are where movement's less restricted. There may be opportunities there for you to volunteer. And it's a really great way of getting involved and getting to know the people on the ground, as well as getting some hands-on time with the animals. Wendy, I think that's just about us. So
yes, just a comment there that maybe we should get a fish tank. Well, we do have a tank with a couple of endangered turtles in it, local, turtles that we've grown from 20-cent pieces. So, but they're not very entertaining.
As you said, you're on Team Marsupial, not Team Reptile.
I'm on Team Marsupial, folks.
Well, I'm there with you on Team Marsupial. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us. It was
such a pleasure. And I know everyone is willing you on. And thanks to Susie, I'm just, she's got a note here, turtles all the way down. Quite right. Well done. And thank you so much. And thanks to all our lovely hosts at Scotia. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience, and one that we'll absolutely treasure.
Great. And of course, thank you for your support of AWC, and to all of our supporters. We couldn't do any of this work without you. If you're not a supporter and you've been inspired by this conversation or by our work, you can sign up at australianwildlife.org. There's a donate button. So if you'd like to make a contribution to this work, that's all very much appreciated. Now, we're taking a short break next week, but I'll be back the week after with an update from our project in the Pilliga. So that's in the largest patch of remaining forest inland of the Great Divide, where we've got a project working with New South Wales National Parks. So I'll be talking to our operations manager there, Wayne Sparrow, as well as the wildlife ecologist, Greg Holland. And they'll talk about how the reintroductions are going, construction of that fenced area, working with national parks in the Pilliga, and all of the latest from up there, including plans for further reintroductions. So I hope you'll join me. That's Thursday, 27th of August, so 2 weeks from now. And I might finish with a video. I'll see if this works. Video is usually a bit dodgy over Zoom, but this is a video of Wendy Harmer releasing a bilby. Props to Rhiannon, who was the
bilbies.
That's right. Okay, and we'll just see if the connection holds up for this. But Wendy, thanks again, and everyone else, I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
And don't forget to put enough petrol in the tank.
All right, here goes. So, carefully releasing the bilby from the bag.
Oh, that's so cool.
Thanks, Wendy. We'll leave it there.
Thank you, Joey.